Hey everyone, my name is Chris Harders and this is Mystics Among Us. This is episode 1. And the goal for this episode, the goal for the whole show is to help normalize that everyday mysticism. When I had my awakening, I'm going to go into that here. People have asked me over time, what's my story? And I mean, at some point, I guess you got to hear it. But when I had my awakening, I really wanted to get to connect with other people who were on their journey, and it took a while. It took going to different workshops. It took, just listening to podcasts and YouTube videos where I could, reading a lot of books and understanding people's stories. But then, when I got to go a little bit further down the rabbit hole, and because of the, spiritual growth I went through, I started relating to other mystics on that level. I got to have really cool conversations. And in those conversations, it actually helped me clarify my gifts and also how do I apply this in everyday life. So I would ask somebody, well, tell me more about this. How is it that you protect yourself? How is it that you heal someone? How is it that you are able to receive information from source or from others, or to see entities and beings? What is that really like in your lived experience? And by getting these different maps of the world from these people, they're different maps of how they're receiving and interpreting this reality we're in, it helped me clarify things for myself, and I hope that it can be useful for you too. So I plan to bring other people onto the show to get to have discussions with them. Maybe we'll use this whiteboard behind me for those who are watching this podcast. For those who are listening, we'll explain what's going on. But in that way, hopefully your journey can become even smoother than, mine was. And I guess that kind of leads into what is my story, because once you understand my story, who knows, maybe it'll start getting some light bulbs for you. And if you've been curious of what my story is, here we go. So my name is Chris, and a lot of people know me now from the Mindful Mondays that I host here in Austin, that are these weekly communal events that are part community, like connection building, part mini workshop related to something within the spiritual space, related into something within metaphysics, whether it's energetic protection, learning how to use your abilities, learning cleansing or clearing, or all these different forms of spiritual development, growth, and practice. Some people know me from that. Some people might know me from social media, just publishing what I have found to be true, or maybe know me in another way. But in this podcast, what I'm going to be guiding people through is first my journey, and then really getting to talk to other people in their journey, and now how do they experience the spiritual world in everyday life, so that hopefully it can be a benefit for you. And hopefully if you feel like you're alone right now on your spiritual journey, which I was at one point during my, what I'm calling struggle fest, but really the dark night of the soul, hopefully you have a little bit more, normalcy to the whole thing. So in brief details, again, probably more of my story will get shared as I'm talking with other people, but in brief details, I kind of look at things as before my spiritual awakening, and then, the years after and the development to who I am now. But in the before stage, I grew up as a Catholic child and grew up in the Catholic faith. And there was a lot of guilt and fear based in this. So somewhere along there, I decided to kind of not really worry about God anymore, because if God was this guilt-ridden, hell-bound kind of person saying, if you don't do everything right, you're going to go to hell, why did I want this man in my life, or this being in my life, to be controlling me? And at least that's the way I saw it, because I realized I wasn't really that satisfied with my life at that point in time. But, I'd gone to school, I'd behaved pretty well in school, and this led to me early in my professional life having a pretty safe job as a software consultant. My degree was in mechanical engineering, and I was just an atheist, kind of going through life, not ho-hum. I ended up moving to Vegas when I was 23, and I left my job in software consulting, became a club promoter. I lived with dating coaches for a few years, because at the time, my life really, I was struggling with relationships, especially. And what I learned by being a dating coach was my worldview started shifting pretty substantially, because how I learned to relate with people became more nuanced. I was formerly very socially awkward. Even though I wanted to have friends, I didn't really know how to create good connections with people. And so that became enhanced by being a dating coach, or by first learning dating and how to do that, and then by being a dating coach. But again, all the lessons that I learned at that point in time were much more mechanical. They were more behavioral based. They were what to do, what to say, what to wear, where to go. And so this led to short-term connections, but I struggled with the longer-term connections until I started getting a little bit more emotionally savvy. And then what would happen somewhere around 2016, 2017 is my mother would get sick with cancer. It was a few years before this. And for a while, she was just going down the typical Western medicine route, going down the recommendations they had. And for a moment, there was remission, but then it came back. And it was around the time when it came back that a friend mentioned to me this idea of alternative medicine, of herbs and these modalities that weren't part of Western medicine that maybe could be helpful for her and seemed to be far less harmful than some of the Western medicine practices. And this was confusing to me because I had a lot of faith in science as I'd known it at the time. And I thought, well, why would they possibly rule out things that could be useful? So I began to get curious about the alternative medicine world, and this would just start poking holes in my map of the world. I thought I had a very good understanding of how the world was laid out, that, this is just how things are. Wasn't too worried if there's a God up there. And this is when I started getting curious. My mom would go on to pursue some alternative medicines, some new tech that was not yet approved in the US, some more holistic practices. It's possible it extended her prognosis, but she eventually would pass away in 2018. And this would sort of trigger for me a question of what is life all about? She died at 60, maybe 61, I believe it was 60. And it led to the question of what's life all about? What are we living for? Are we living for retirement? And what if retirement isn't a guarantee because we might pass away sooner? And so what are we living for? So I started tuning in to this question and started realizing that there was a lot of self-love that I wanted to do and healing for self. And so I'd go through a whole bunch of different practices in order to do this. I also smoked a copious amount of marijuana at this period of time, not so much as a way to tune out, but one, because I was curious, was it useful or not? Because I met all these people who thought marijuana was profound and then people who didn't like it. I had mixed experiences with it, but I decided to smoke it until I decided whether I liked it or not. So for about 100 days, it took me 100 days to decide, I think I like marijuana. And I would continue smoking it till roughly my spiritual awakening. And the beauty of marijuana for me, I don't do really any substances at all anymore, but for me, for a period of time, it was only debilitating. It did not enhance my relationships with people. It basically brought me into my own head, and I couldn't function. I can't function very well in the world when I'm high. But it allowed me to be present with my thoughts in a way that I previously had not been. And I began to actually not hate myself and not hate my thoughts, and eventually began to enjoy my thoughts. And I eventually began to connect in with higher realms, get intuitive hits, and this began a new flow and process for me. And come to around April or May of 2019, I had a oneness experience. So the way it happened for me is I was in my apartment. I had sort of blocked myself in the room for a day or two, or my intention was to just be locked in my room for a day or two. And I had a specific reason for this. I was teaching a communication class at the time, and I noticed that people were very lonely. And I wanted to try to experience the loneliness that they were experiencing to see then how to help them not experience it anymore. So I decided to lock myself in my room for a day or two to get no sunlight, and perhaps this would sort of trigger me not beginning to feel lonely, and then I would get to figure out how do I work myself out of this to help people who were experiencing debilitating loneliness. So that was the intention. What happened though is I began to feel a pain in my chest early on within the first day probably of being locked in my apartment. I wasn't paying attention to the clocks or anything at the time. And I felt this pain in my chest. I'd felt it many times before, and I'd always been afraid I had a weak heart, and that was the pain. But it was right in the center of my chest, right, I guess, I don't really know what you call this, where the ribs are fused together, but in the center of the chest, the heart center, we could say. And I got tired, again, on this whole journey of knowing the self better, I got tired of living in fear. I got tired of thinking one day I might die because I have a weak heart. And so I decided, what happens if I just keep breathing into this pain in my chest? And I did Google ahead of time, what are the symptoms of a heart attack? They did not match the symptoms I was experiencing. I had my phone right by me while I was doing this process. Probably wouldn't recommend somebody else do it. But while I was doing this process of breathing into my chest area, into the pain, I held my hands over my chest, over my heart. I was breathing into the pain. I called in the spirit of my mom. And by the way, I still was an atheist at this time, or agnostic, but I knew about energy. And in my studies of neurolinguistic programming, which I'd taken in Austin, in order to develop myself as a better coach, I understood this idea of state, and it's sort of the way people make us feel when we're around them is a lot of who they represent for us. So I tuned into the energy that my mom represented for me, and that brought a sense of her presence into the room with me that night. And so as I was breathing into my heart center, having my phone by me in case I needed to call 911, again, if I had a heart attack and died, I wasn't really that concerned at the moment. I didn't think I went anywhere. I just thought I would just kind of disappear, but that was fine with me. I was curious what would happen. So I kept breathing in and breathing in. The pain got worse and worse, and I kept thinking, okay, I think I'm okay. I think I'm okay. And then there was this cracking sensation, and it was very uncomfortable. But immediately after that, there was this moment of bliss. So I expanded out into, I don't know what I would call it. I expanded out into everything all at once. I connected in with every tree, rock, beyond, to the edge of the universe. It felt like my body had no limits to it. The colors I saw were so visceral, so bright and brilliant. And I didn't really seem to have any weight to me. There was a warmth about everything. And it was kind of like being in this crazy lava lamp experience. And I also felt love in the most powerful way I'd ever felt. I don't quite know how long this experience lasted, probably not that long. And I will say, while 99% of me felt, that I was to the extent an edge of the universe, there was 1% of me that still realized I had a body, that I was this identity that is Chris in this lifetime. And so all of that would kind of come down. I would come back into being embodied. And for the next couple of days, I was sort of floating through life. I was just in bliss. As I would walk around, I would smell a rose, and I could just smell it for an hour. I would meditate on the corner, just standing there with my eyes closed. Everything was fine. People were just loving and kind to me. My neighbor knocked on my door. I had just watched an Elvis documentary and thought how great it would be to play the guitar again. My neighbor knocked on the door and asked if I wanted anything because she was moving, and one of the things she happened to have was a guitar. There were all these mini synchronicities that happened. I had to leave my job because it no longer felt in alignment. And the day after leaving, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize that invited me to participate in a focus group where I was getting paid $2,000 a week for a couple weeks. And it was just so weird. Money would show and these relationships would show. And it was very exciting until kind of everything came crashing down. So I was in this moment of bliss. I was beginning to have these esoteric conversations with people. It was very kind of trippy and psychedelic. And somebody even mentioned to me, Chris, I think you might be an empath. And I had never heard of this term before, but I listened to an empath podcast, and this is how I found my first teacher. She talked about how empaths need specific tools to not get overwhelmed by the world, that these are these people that can take on the emotions of others and mistake them as their own, and they might be overwhelmed by the world around them. And I noticed these overwhelming sensations, especially since this awakening period. And this empath label was very meaningful at the time. So I found I followed up with this teacher, and she had a very basic class. I think it was called the Empath Boot Camp or something like that. Boot Camp for highly sensitive people and empaths, something like that. And I took it, and in it, she had a very simple tool. It was called a grounding cord. I teach it every Mindful Monday. I guide people through it, or oftentimes I'm the one leading the meditation. I guide people through it. I've got other videos in other places that address this. But in it, you just imagine that you are in a bubble and that there is a cord that connects you. I can't remember in her meditation if it was just from your root or if it was from your aura. I think it was from your root, that you have this sort of cord that connects you from your root energetically to the center of the earth, and it anchors you there. And this way, as you're going about life, when other people's stuff comes into your field, rather than you holding on to it, you just allow it to move through you down the grounding cord, and the earth can take care of it for you. So for me, this was quite a substantial tool. It was very useful. Again, her video, I don't think it was very long. It was maybe 6 minutes long. But when I watched it, I was able to begin to go through life again. I was able to go into a grocery store and not get overwhelmed by the beeps and the sounds. I was able to interact with people again and not be sort of overwhelmed by it all. She also had a few other tools that I would use, but that grounding cord really was the most useful for me. And I followed up with her to ask a little bit more about that, and she said, if the grounding cord works so well for you, you might have other intuitive abilities that you could really turn on right now. I was curious about this. I didn't quite know what she meant. She meant, well, and she was saying, well, psychic abilities like clairvoyance, audience, clairsentience, claircognizance. And I had heard of these terms, and of course I used to roll my eyes at these terms and think that anyone talking about this stuff was just doing cold reads or warm reads or mentalism. But again, I had just done an imaginary technique of using my imagination to imagine I was connected in with the center of the earth, and I had very real impact from that. So why wouldn't I go down this route? So I began to study her version of developing your intuitive abilities, and this would be my sort of introduction into the world of spirituality. She had a whole map of how she saw the spiritual world work, about the aura, about the chakras, about the different levels and dimensions of reality. And I've seen other people with other opinions of how reality works. But it was an extremely eye-opening time for me. This idea of us not being alone, us being one race of existence of many, us being humans. And then there's even the question of, are we a mix of a whole bunch of alien DNA? I don't know. I thought it was an interesting thing to be proposed. Her being very big on discernment and choosing who to follow up with, who to trust, who to really trust at the end of the day myself more than anything else. Very useful time. And this also was the time, while very exciting, I was in a deep struggle fest. So by struggle fest, I mean I was having my dark night of the soul. So while I had been very connected with my intuition, especially after my awakening, this intuition side was great. There was also a period of time where I was very sensitive still, because I was going through what some would call a spiritual emergency or ascension symptoms. I was having weird sensations throughout my body. I still couldn't be around certain people, even with the grounding cord and some of my other protection tools. Certain people still would overwhelm me. I could feel their grief. If there was gossip, I would start getting sick and flustered by it. So it was a very challenging time. I sought out a bunch of different healers from a bunch of different modalities, healers in Qigong, in Quantum Touch, in Body Talk, surely more. And eventually I would begin to come down a little bit from that. I would go to my first actual workshop where I would meet for the first time ever, other people who were doing who were studying and curious about this energetic world. Before, my teacher, she was based in Australia, so I knew her from online, but hadn't met her in person. I'd been to yoga classes. I'd been to other things where I hoped to meet people where we could geek out and talk about this, but that just never really happened. When I went to a spirit fair, it was more about the vendors and what they were trying to sell than people coming together to connect. When I went to a crystal shop, it was fun, but people were there to buy crystals, not to talk and connect. When I would go to yoga, people were there to do yoga. Maybe there'd be a little discussion before or after, but again, they weren't really there for that. So I was in this exciting time, but I didn't have anyone to share it with aside from a friend or two who I could text about what was going on with me. And so this was kind of the struggle fest, the challenging time. And that Quantum Touch class, I would end up doing Quantum Touch 1, Quantum Touch Supercharging, and Quantum Touch Level 2. And it's a form of energy healing. Again, a lot of the energy healing modalities have so much overlap in terms of calling energy in and moving it through you, and your intention and attention being pretty much the core of it. But it was the first time that I got to be with people in person, and when I got to not feel like a crazy person for my way of experiencing the world. And so in that way, it was a very meaningful class. And since then, I've even gotten to meet the founder of Quantum Touch here in Austin, Texas, which has been very meaningful too. Now, this would eventually, doing these was great. I was still alone, still like trying to figure out, what's going on with me. I was living with my dad at this point, because after I left my job, I didn't have a form of income, and the universe just provided me money. That eventually went away too. So I was struggling. I needed to kind of find my way. I was living with my dad. That was imperfect. And I finally decided to apply some strategies related to law of attraction that I'd heard about. I kind of rolled my eyes about previously. I tried to do, and this time I thought, okay, I'm going to do it. So I knew I wanted to live in Lake Tahoe. I didn't know how I was going to live there. I knew I wanted to be in this beautiful mountain town. And so I just decided to create a vision board and to tune into a scene or two of living in Lake Tahoe. And I would do this every day. Every time I was a little frustrated, I would tune into this vision, just a little bit, tune into what the air would be like, how it would be to ski down the slopes, just little clips of that. And within 10 days of doing this, an opportunity popped out for me to move to Lake Tahoe, free, to move to Lake Tahoe. My cousin, who I hadn't really connected with in a number of years, I happened to bump into at a kind of random family event. And I found out that I had mentioned I wanted to live in Tahoe. Her mother, my aunt, mentioned, oh, well, she's going there. She has an empty room. She'd probably like it if you were there. And so I got to actually live rent-free in Tahoe. Again, this is one of those beauty things about the law of attraction. It would take me a while to still fully embody the concepts of law of attraction, but that was the starting point. So this ended me up in Tahoe, and again, I was still new or felt new in the spiritual world. Had my class, my intuitive coach, but I reached out to her and said, I feel like there's more I need. And she said, well, you could go to psychic school. And I didn't know what she meant. And she said, there's actual schools that will teach you psychic abilities. Sure, you studied with me, but that was one-on-one. You could actually read with other people. You can practice giving each other readings. You're going to learn all kinds of stuff. So then and funny enough, as soon as she and I had that conversation, the very next day I turned on the TV, and the first thing that pops on the TV, it was like the morning show or the early show or Today Show. They said, did you know you can go to psychic school? And so it's just sort of this wink from the universe of, hey, maybe this is your thing. So I would go and I would study. It was very hard for me to make sense of what was the right thing for me to do in terms of psychic school, who was the right program. Because if you go online, there's no shortage of teachers who teach intuition. And then the question is, who's real, who's going to be actually useful? And there was something that kept coming up for me. I kept seeing the term Berkeley Psychic Institute in different psychic schools over time, and I thought that's interesting. And then I would go ahead and buy this book. This is the book Basic Psychic Development, written by John Friedlander and Gloria Hemscher, and they give kind of the outline of what was taught in the Berkeley Psychic Institute, or what they say they learned in the Berkeley Psychic Institute. And so I went through every single exercise in this book. I can't remember how many there were. Thank goodness I have a background in NLP, which goes into very specific protocols for clearing or healing or bringing about a state that's useful for you, or undoing trauma, all these different fascinating topics and strategies. But I mean, this is not an easy read. This is very kind of involved with how to set a grounding cord, how to move energy through the system. And it was a good primer. And I thought, okay, I think that's worth, now that I've done this and realized I can kind of get something out of it, why don't I try an actual class? So first I would study, I was going through a number of different schools and what they're offering. The first school I went through like a psychic foundations class with. They weren't the one that felt right for me. It was still a useful class. I would eventually end up going to a school based in San Diego called Intuitive Insights, and I would study with them for about a year. I would first study their Clairvoyant 1 class and their Clairvoyant 2 class and their Spiritual Teachers and Leaders class. And so I went through these and learned a great number of tools. And I thought I was just going to become a reader. I thought I was just going to become a psychic reader who would offer people psychic readings. Now, what I actually ended up getting out of that, which was far more useful, is learning energy tools. I took what the foundations were that I learned there and began applying them to my everyday life for clearing, for making life easier for me, for updating contracts, for clearing karma, for calling in what I wanted. And my life just started getting better. Now, in terms of actually doing readings, that was, I quickly learned that wasn't as interesting for me. It can be helpful to help with healing and things like that. I do it occasionally, but it's not, I realized I don't actually want to go down that route as the main reader. I would continue to go on different travels. I would end up in spiritual hubs like Shasta, Sedona, Seti Ranch, San Diego. San Diego, I got to even meet some of my teachers, some of my fellow students, which was special. And it was around 2024 where I'd done all this work. I'd had all this growth, and yet it wasn't reflecting in my everyday life in terms of my finances weren't where I wanted them to be. My profession, I really was confused with what I was doing. Formerly, I was a dating coach, and I was like, I don't want to do this anymore, but I don't know what to do next. And so this was a very confusing time, and it's where I decided that I was just going to study this stuff. I was just really going to understand the law of attraction in a way I hadn't previously, in a way that I had never done before. And so I just bought every book I could on the matter. But what I really started with was this book, Reality Transurfing by Vadim Zeland. And I had already heard about this. I had heard about this about 10 years prior from a Russian man who went from being a bank teller to making, at the time, $30,000 a month. And he swore by this book. He was Russian, and Vadim Zeland's a Russian mystic. So he would play on repeat this book as an audiobook. He would go to sleep listening to it, and then he would read it. And of course, I hadn't heard of it because, I just hadn't heard of much of this sort of stuff. But I finally felt like I was ready to understand it. And so I just bought this book. When I bought it at the time, I didn't have much money to my name. I think I had a couple $100s. And this book was like $86. So it was a big chunk of money for me, but I thought I need to get it. I also bought the audiobook, which was a 35-hour audiobook. And I read this book the first time. I think I read it in a couple days. And then I would reread it. And then I would listen to the audiobook on repeat. And I would go and I ended up buying every book that was translated into English by Vadim Zeland. I would start studying other books related to the law of attraction, certainly the Abraham Hicks books. And there are just many books. I also was reading a lot of books by New Thought, which was sort of this almost like church that used to exist related to law of attraction, how our thoughts create our reality. I just wanted to understand it as fully as possible. And then I knew I needed to find a way of aligning with the money plane. And so this would come first in the form of driving Uber, then in becoming a substitute teacher, then a second grade teacher, and now kind of doing what I'm doing as I guess a spiritual teacher of sorts. And all of this, though, what I blended was these concepts that I understood of reality transurfing, reality creation, what I kind of consider of the way the world works. I basically supercharged with the energy tools that I initially learned through my psychic school and then began to apply to everyday life with my own experience. And in time, I took these tools, they were a great start, and then kind of made them my own. So like in my school, we talk about using source energy, and there's a sort of very basic way of doing a source healing. I've talked about it in other videos, but essentially you imagine a person in a bubble and that there's a white line that connects them up to source, and that white line and white gold line that connects them up to source just tops them off with whatever they need for healing. Well, I started having a much more powerful download of how this was supposed to work, of how energetic balancing was supposed to work for people, how we could use source energy to begin to paint the future that we wanted for ourselves. We could imagine source energy moving along our timeline to heal, to up-level it, to sort of pave the path for us in a powerful and useful way. I would apply these energy tools to my dating life and have highly compatible women show up very quickly when that's what I was called to do. And when I shared them with other people, this worked very well for them too. So that's where kind of everything went. At least this is my history so far. I don't actually have family that's interested in this at the time. My mom does communicate with me at times from the other side. Fortunately, I also did learn how to communicate with the dead through my psychic school. And I don't do it all that much, but when I want to, that is an option for me. And then of course, now here I am in September of last year, September of 2025. I knew I wanted to teach, or I felt really called to the idea of how cool it would be if people came together. For me at the time, I thought it was going to be around reality creation and manifestation, because there's such a value in the coherent effect of people with similar mindset tuning into possibility, coming together to call in what they want for themselves and for others. But I wasn't really getting energetic bite on that from people. When I posted it, I got one person showing up. That wasn't quite what I wanted. And then I tuned back in to where I was at when I first began on my journey, with the excitement that I felt when I first tuned in. When I would watch a movie like X-Men and think, man, like this is actually happening for me. And yet I didn't have that in my everyday life anymore. I didn't have that certainly in my life then. And even at that point in time, now 7, 8 years later, I didn't have just a community of people that I could call on as friends, as colleagues, to talk about this stuff. So I ended up creating an event called Mindful Monday. Mindful Monday meditation, energy healing, and psychic fun. And the goal of it was to get to do all the things that I'd always wanted to do, of getting to geek out with other people on a regular basis about what seems to be working for us in the spiritual world. And that has really taken on a life of its own. It's been quite fun. And I hope that this, Mystics Among Us podcast can be a great supplement to it, or a great addition, or we'll find the way that they all come together. But Mindful Monday is certainly for the community and for people getting to grow in their own way. And then this, is an opportunity for mystics to come together, share, and hopefully bring you to where you need to be mystically. I know it's not uncommon for us to be able to activate each other when we are tuned into our own abilities more, something to that degree. So I suppose we'll leave it here for this first episode. I don't know what else you need to know from me. I could tell you I come in peace. So, go with that what you will. But for the people who wanted to know my story, that's kind of the nutshell of it. I guess you could say this is sort of the classic hero story, right? Something bad happens, mom dies. The person feels the call in some way. They go through a struggle fest. Then they go through and meet their heroes and find their mentors and all of that stuff. And then eventually begin to integrate everything that they're learning to come back home to share. So I don't know, I guess we can call it that, or we can just say I'm a dude who's trying to figure things out and finds a lot more fun geeking out with people about this than doing it in another way. And I guess to begin to bring this podcast to a close, this episode, what is common for me to have discussions with people about when we are exchanging our mystic ideas is, what are our abilities? And in this episode, I'll say my abilities are to read energy and then move energy. And there's more things than that, but if I were to sum it up, read energy, I use the different clairs, the clairvoyance, cognizance, sentience, and then clairaudience when it pops in for me, to get a sense of the area. Usually I can just tune in, and some people would call this remote view, tune into the place that I'm going to be, get an energetic read of the room, but then more importantly, I notice what energy is there, and then I update it. I clear out stuck energy that's not meant to be in the space. I reset the room's energy, and then I also prepare it for me, or if it's for somebody else I'm doing it on behalf of, I'll do it for them. This might also involve me setting somebody's aura to make them more attractive for a partner, more attractive for the thing they're trying to call in. This might be having me elevate somebody's energy fields so they can more easily move at the vibration of what it is that they'd like to attract in. And I do feel like I have a special relationship with source energy in the way that it moves through me. And that's just something that's kind of turned on for me over the years. So we might talk about that in other lessons. I've guided people through how to activate and access source energy. It's going to be based on the person's level of sensitivity to energy coming in, for how easily they notice it. But all of us can notice it just by beginning to use our imagination more. And again, these are all just sort of energy tools. When I was waking up, and my first book is about energy tools within this space. When I was first waking up, I would use energy tools more than almost anything, because while it was interesting to be able to read energy, it was much more powerful to say, okay, well, if I got this reading, or even if I didn't, what can I do to make sure that I feel protected, that I feel clear, that I feel healed, that I feel like I can call in what it is that I want. And so that's what I have fun playing with day in and day out, what I'll workshop with other people and say, hey, do you notice this working for you? Can you try it out and let me know how it works? And also, of course, there's other abilities and things that I have, but that would be the main one that I like to tune into certainly on a daily basis. So till next time, thank you for tuning in to episode 1. And I hope that, this may become a great resource for you on your journey, however that may go.